Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we stand at Mariner's Dock, where the sea keeps secrets and the fog listens. A violin once played here every night at dusk. Its melody drifted across the water until the music stopped. At dawn, a violinist is found dead on the planks. No struggle, no witnesses, only silence and salt air. Was it an accident, a jealous rival, or a crime timed as precisely as a final note? This is Death of the Violinist at Mariner's Dock, a classic mystery investigated by Hercule Poirot. Settle in, lower the lights, and listen carefully, because at Mariner's Dock, every sound matters. Chapter 1. The music that belonged to the fog. Mariner's Dock was never truly silent. Even at night, when the town slept and the taverns closed their doors, the harbor breathed. Ropes creaked against posts, water sighed against wood, and distant bells from anchored ships drifted across the fog like half-remembered thoughts. But there was one sound the dock had come to expect: the violin. Every evening, just as the lamps were lit and the last fisherman returned, a solitary figure appeared at the far end of the pier. He stood where the dock narrowed, where land seemed to hesitate before surrendering to the sea, and he played, not loudly, not brilliantly, but with a patience that made people stop walking. The violinist never announced himself. He did not play for coins. He did not bow when the music ended. He simply packed his instrument, nodded to no one in particular, and disappeared into the fog. And then one evening the music did not stop. On the night of October 3rd, the fog rolled in earlier than usual. It arrived like a decision already made, thick, heavy, and unmoved by the lanterns that attempted to push it back. The water darkened to polished slate, and the dock lights cast blurred halos instead of reflections. By 7:30, the violinist was already playing. Mrs. Agnes Bell, returning from the grocer's, paused near the harbor steps. She had heard the man many times before, yet something about that night made her stop completely. The melody was slower, more deliberate. It lingered on notes longer than usual, as though the player were unwilling to let them go. "He sounds tired," she murmured. A sailor nearby shrugged. "Sounds like goodbye to me." Mrs. Bell did not like that thought. She left before the music ended. The violinist played until nearly 9, longer than ever before. A dockhand named Samuel Pike noticed it while coiling rope near Warehouse 3. "He didn't move," Pike would later say. "Not once, just kept playing, like he was waiting for something." At 8:45, a man paused at the edge of the pier, tall, well-dressed, his coat far too fine for dock work. He stood just beyond the lantern light listening. Pike noticed him, so did the violinist. For the briefest moment the music faltered, then it resumed, steadier than before. At 9 o'clock the violin stopped, not with a flourish, not with a final dramatic chord. It simply ended. No one noticed immediately. The fog swallowed the dock the way it always did, and the harbor resumed its ordinary sounds. The dockhands finished their work. The last boat horn sounded faintly out at sea, and somewhere on Mariner's Dock, a violinist remained standing, motionless. The body was discovered at dawn. The tide was low, exposing slick stones and seaweed beneath the planks. A young fisherman named Oliver Trent spotted the figure first while preparing his boat. He thought the man was sleeping. That illusion lasted until he stepped closer. The violinist lay on his side near the edge of the dock, one arm folded beneath him, the other resting strangely near the violin case. His face was calm, too calm, and his eyes stared into nothing. The violin lay nearby, intact, no blood, no sign of struggle, no obvious wound, only the sea breeze lifting the corner of his coat as if trying to wake him. By mid-morning the dock was cordoned off. People gathered anyway. They always did. Some whispered about accidents, a slip perhaps, or a sudden illness. Others spoke more cautiously, glancing toward the water as though it might be listening. He was healthy, Mrs. Bell insisted, strong enough to play for hours. "A man doesn't just die standing up," a sailor muttered. The constable arrived shortly after, notebook in hand, expression already troubled. Dr. Leonard Frost followed, his examination brief and inconclusive. "No external injuries," Frost said. "No water in the lungs. He didn't drown." "Heart?" the constable asked. Possibly, Frost replied, but something feels arranged. The words settled uncomfortably among the onlookers. Arranged. The violinist was identified within the hour. His name was Adrien Leclerc, a foreigner, though no one could quite agree from where. He had arrived in the town 6 months earlier, rented a small room above the chandlery, and paid promptly, always in cash. He asked no questions, he answered none. He simply played. By noon, a telegram had been sent, not to the nearest city inspector, not to the harbor authorities, but to a man known for hearing what others ignored. Hercule Poirot received the message just after lunch. He read it once, carefully, then again. "A violinist," he murmured, "at a dock." Poirot adjusted his moustache thoughtfully. "Music," he said softly, "is rarely innocent." He folded the telegram, rang for his luggage, and requested the next available train. Back at Mariner's Dock, the fog had lifted slightly by afternoon, just enough to reveal the ordinary nature of the place. That, too, unsettled people. It was easier to blame the fog. The violinist's room was searched, few belongings were found, clothes neatly folded, a violin maintenance kit, and a notebook filled with musical notation. Nothing personal, nothing revealing, except for one page, a single line written carefully at the bottom. "Tonight, I will finish it." The constable closed the notebook slowly. "Finish what?" he muttered. The sea did not answer. As evening approached, the dock returned to uneasy routine. Lanterns were lit, boats rocked gently, conversations lowered when passing the spot where the body had lain. And without anyone meaning to, people began listening more closely to the sounds around them, to footsteps, to water, to silence, because one thing was certain: someone had listened very carefully the night Adrien Leclerc died, and they had waited for the music to end. Chapter 2, The Harbor That Remembered Too Much. Chapter 3, The Violin Case That Did Not Belong. The violin case lay on the table like a question that had learned to stay quiet. It was open now, its velvet lining exposed, one string loose, the others perfectly tuned. Too perfectly tuned, Hercule Poirot thought, for an instrument that had supposedly played for nearly 2 hours without pause. Poirot stood in the chandlery room, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the violin as though it might speak if given the proper attention. "Constable Rowe," Poirot said gently, "tell me, who found the violin?" Rowe cleared his throat. "Dockhand Pike, near the body," Poirot nodded. "And did he say where it was?" "Beside the violinist. Case closed. Instrument out." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, beside him." He leaned closer, not touching. "Then why," Poirot asked softly, "is there no salt?" "Residue on the lower bout," Rowe blinked. "Sir?" Poirot gestured. "The dock air is heavy with salt. Instruments absorb it quickly, especially wood this thin." Rowe swallowed. "So you're saying—" Poirot nodded. "The violin was not lying there long." He straightened and turned toward the window. From here the dock stretched out in clean lines, orderly, disciplined, and carefully misleading. Lantern hooks cast long shadows, ropes hung in familiar loops. Everything looked as though it belonged exactly where it was, which made Poirot uneasy. "Order," he murmured, "is sometimes the loudest disguise." The case itself interested him more. Poirot lifted it carefully. Inside the lid, barely visible beneath the hinge, was a faint indentation, not damage, but wear. A repeated contact point. Poirot traced it lightly with a gloved finger. "This violin," he said, "was returned to its case many times in a hurry." Rowe frowned. "He played every night." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but not always until the end." Poirot looked up. "Tell me, Constable, who usually stayed late at the dock?" Rowe hesitated. "Captain Morton, sometimes Helena March. And Pike, of course." Poirot nodded. "And who left early?" Rowe blinked. "The violinist." Poirot smiled faintly. They began again with Samuel Pike. This time Poirot did not ask about music. He asked about routine. "You finished work at 9?" Poirot said conversationally. Pike nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." "And the violin stopped just after 9?" Yes, Poirot tilted his head. And yet you stayed. Pike hesitated. Just tidying, Poirot nodded. For how long? Pike swallowed. I don't know. 10 minutes, Poirot smiled gently. That is interesting, Pike frowned. Why? Poirot's voice remained calm. Because 10 minutes after 9, the violin was already back in its case. Pike's hands froze mid-motion. Rose stiffened. Poirot continued, You did not see Adrian Leclerc pack it away. Pike's voice was tight. No, Poirot nodded. Then someone else did. Next came Helena March. Poirot visited her cafe again, this time at closing hour. She stood behind the counter, expression composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. You closed early, Poirot said. Yes, she replied. The fog. Poirot nodded. Fog is convenient, her eyes flashed. You said that before. Poirot smiled faintly. Because it remains true. Poirot leaned in. You heard the final note, he said. Helena stiffened. Everyone did. Poirot shook his head gently. No, he said. Some were already gone. Her lips parted. What do you mean? Poirot's voice softened. The final note was played without vibrato. He said, Flat, controlled. Helena stared. So? So, Poirot continued. The violinist was already exhausted or distracted. Helena's gaze dropped. And yet, Poirot added, you served a customer after 9. She looked up sharply. Poirot met her gaze. The man in the fine coat, Poirot said. You saw him, Helena swallowed. Briefly, Poirot nodded. And did he leave before the music ended? Helena's silence answered for her. Poirot's attention then turned to Captain Elias Morton. Morton stood on his freighter's deck, arms crossed, the sea behind him restless. You dislike the music, Poirot said. Morton grunted. It marked my unloading schedule. Poirot smiled. So you listened? Morton bristled. I didn't care. Poirot nodded. And yet you knew exactly when it stopped. Morton's jaw tightened. Poirot leaned closer. Tell me, Captain, Poirot said softly. Did you hear the violin stop? Or did you hear something else? Morton hesitated. Poirot waited. A shout, Morton admitted quietly. Maybe. Poirot nodded. And did you investigate? Morton shook his head. Dock's none of my business after dark. Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, he said. The perfect alibi. That evening, Poirot returned alone to the dock. He stood where Adrian Leclerc had stood. He imagined the bow rising, the note stretching, and then interruption, not loud, not violent, a presence. Poirot knelt and examined the planks. There, barely visible, a scrape mark, not from a fall. From a case being dragged briefly, then lifted. Poirot straightened. So, he murmured, someone packed the violin before the death. He looked toward the water. And someone stayed to ensure the body was found in silence. Poirot returned to the inn and opened his notebook. He wrote only 3 names, Pike, March, Morton. Then he drew a line beneath them. The music ended early, the night did not. Poirot closed the notebook. The violin, he said softly to himself, was never the point. He looked toward the harbor lights flickering in the distance. It was the permission. Chapter 4. The signal hidden in the sound. The sea had a way of repeating itself. Wave after wave brushed the pilings beneath Mariner's dock with the same patient rhythm, as though rehearsing an alibi too often told. Hercule Poirot stood listening not to the water, but to the absence of the violin, the missing layer that made every other sound feel exposed. It is always the same, Poirot murmured. When the signal is removed, the pattern reveals itself. Constable Frederick Rowe shifted beside him. A signal, sir? You're certain? Poirot smiled faintly. Certain enough to test it. That afternoon, Poirot asked Rowe for a simple thing, access, not to files, not to witnesses, to the dock itself, uninterrupted, unsupervised. and preferably empty. Rowe complied reluctantly. By early evening, Mariner's Dock lay quieter than usual. Word had spread that the police were reenacting something, and dock workers were quick to find reasons to leave early. Only the lanterns remained. Poirot positioned himself at the spot where Adrien Leclerc had stood. He closed his eyes and imagined the scene as it must have unfolded, the fog thickening, the bow rising, the long sustained notes floating outward like a question. "Constable," Poirot said softly, "stand where Captain Morton's ship was moored that night." Rowe obeyed, walking to the freighter's berth. Poirot raised his voice slightly. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," Rowe replied. Poirot nodded. "Now," he said, "imagine a violin." Poirot produced a small tuning fork from his pocket. He struck it gently against the dock rail. The sound was thin but precise, a clean, sustained note that carried farther than one would expect in fog. Rowe stiffened. "I hear it clearly," Poirot smiled. "Yes, sound travels horizontally over water?" He struck the fork again, this time longer. "Now, imagine this note repeating, night after night," Poirot continued, "at the same hour, with the same pauses." Rowe's eyes widened slightly. Poirot lowered the tuning fork. "The violinist," Poirot said, "was not playing to entertain. He was counting." They moved next to the harbour cafe. Poirot asked Rowe to stand inside while he returned to the dock's edge. When Poirot struck the tuning fork again, Rowe could hear it clearly through the open window, even over the hum of the harbour. Poirot nodded to himself. "The cafe," he said, "was perfectly placed." Rowe frowned. "Placed for what?" Poirot's voice was calm. "For observation and for rendezvous." As darkness fell, Poirot summoned Helena March. She arrived composed, but her eyes darted briefly toward the water. "You asked to see me again," she said coolly. "Yes," Poirot replied, "to hear the music together." "There is no music," she said. Poirot smiled faintly. "Exactly." He struck the tuning fork once more. Helena flinched, just enough. Poirot watched carefully. "Tell me," Poirot said gently, "what did the violin mean to you?" She hesitated. "It meant atmosphere." Poirot nodded. "To you, perhaps. To others, permission." Helena stiffened. "Permission for what?" Poirot leaned closer. "For movement," he said. "For meetings that required no clocks." Helena's composure cracked slightly. "You served a man after 9, Poirot continued. "A man in a fine coat. He did not wait for the music to end." Helena's lips parted. "I didn't think," Poirot raised a hand. "No one ever does." Next came Captain Elias Morton. Poirot met him aboard the freighter at dusk. "You heard a shout," Poirot said without preamble. Morton's eyes narrowed. "I said maybe." Poirot nodded. "And you ignored it." Morton shrugged. "Dock's noisy." Poirot's tone hardened slightly. "Not that night." Morton looked away. Poirot continued. "When the violin stopped early, you noticed." Morton sighed. "Yes." Poirot leaned in. "Because the early stop disrupted the signal." Morton's jaw clenched. "Signal for what?" Poirot smiled faintly. "For a meeting that did not go as planned." Finally, Poirot returned to Samuel Pike. Pike stood by Warehouse 3 again, hands busy, mind elsewhere. "You stayed 10 minutes after the music ended," Poirot said. Pike nodded nervously. "Yes." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Waiting?" Pike swallowed. I was told to." Poirot nodded gently. "By whom?" Pike hesitated, then whispered, "The violinist." Rowe stiffened. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "Now we listen." Pike's voice trembled as he explained. Adrien Leclerc paid him occasionally, small sums, to watch the dock, to note who arrived early, who left late, who always listened. "He said the music told people when it was safe," Pike said. "Safe to meet, safe to move things." Poirot nodded slowly. "And on the final night," Pike swallowed, "he told me to leave early." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "The music ended early," Poirot said softly, "because the meeting had begun." Poirot stepped back into the foggy dock. He could see it now with clarity. The violin signaled the hour, the end of the music signaled privacy, and someone, one of the listeners, had taken advantage of that moment. Poirot turned to Rowe. "The killer," he said, "didn't fear witnesses." Rowe frowned. "Why not?" Poirot smiled grimly. "Because everyone was trained not to look," he said. That night, Poirot wrote in his notebook, "The dock was not the stage, it was the audience." He closed the book. "One of them," he murmured, "used the music as a clock and silence as a blade." Chapter 5. A Night Reconstructed, Note by Note. The dock looked different when one decided to measure it by minutes instead of planks. That, Hercule Poirot believed, was the only honest way to see Mariner's Dock. People remembered places as scenes. Poirot remembered them as sequences. "Tonight," he said calmly to Constable Frederick Rowe, "we give the night its proper shape." Rowe frowned. "You want to recreate it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Not recreate, reconstruct. A recreation flatters memory. A reconstruction interrogates it." The hour before the music they began at 7:30, the same hour the violinist usually arrived. The dock was quieter than usual, but not empty. Lanterns glowed, ropes lay coiled, the harbor breathed. Poirot walked slowly, stopping where Adrien Leclerc had stood night after night. He placed his cane on the planks and looked outward toward the water. "At this hour," Poirot said, "the violin began." Rowe nodded. "People would linger." "Exactly," Poirot replied. "Lingering is a form of listening." Poirot noted sightlines. From the cafe window one could see the far end of the pier. From Captain Morton's freighter one could hear clearly, though not see. From Warehouse 3, Samuel Pike had partial cover and a perfect ear. "3 listeners," Poirot murmured, "each with a different excuse." 8 o'clock. The routine Poirot asked Rowe to mark the time. 8, Rowe said. Poirot nodded. "At 8, Poirot said, nothing unusual happened, and that is important." Rowe frowned. "Why?" "Because crimes hide best inside routine," Poirot replied. "If something always happens at 8, no one questions it." Poirot paced the dock slowly. Captain Morton finishes unloading by 8:30. Helena March serves her last customers shortly after. Samuel Pike begins tidying. Poirot stopped. "And Adrien Leclerc continues to play," he added, unmoving, uninterrupted. Rowe swallowed. "So the killer waited." Poirot nodded. "Patience is not suspicious when it looks like habit." 8:45. The deviation. Poirot checked his watch. "Now," he said, "we reach the deviation." He turned toward the cafe. "At 8:45, a man in a fine coat paused here," Poirot said. "Not to drink, to listen." Rowe frowned. "Helena said he left quickly." Poirot shook his head. "No, she said she closed early." Rowe's eyes widened. "You think he stayed?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I think he waited for a signal." Poirot tapped his cane lightly. "The violin faltered briefly," Poirot continued. "A moment of distraction." Rowe nodded slowly. "Because the violinist noticed him," Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, and that means Adrien Leclerc recognized the man." 9 o'clock. The silence. Poirot stopped at the exact spot where the body had been found. "Now we arrive," he said softly, "at the most important minute." Rowe checked his notes. Just after 9, the music stopped. Poirot nodded. "Earlier than usual," he said, "which tells us 2 things." Rowe waited. "First," Poirot continued, "the meeting had begun. Second, the violinist no longer needed to signal." Rowe's voice dropped. "Because the person he was waiting for had arrived." Poirot smiled. "Precisely." 9:02. The packing. Poirot crouched and examined the planks again. "You see," he said, "packing a violin is not instant." Rowe frowned. "A minute or 2, Poirot nodded. "And Adrien Leclerc was careful with his instrument." Poirot straightened. "Therefore the violin was placed in its case at approximately 9:02. Rowe's eyes widened. But Pike said. Poirot raised a hand. Pike did not see it, he inferred. Poirot walked 2 steps toward the water. And during that minute, Poirot added quietly, someone stood very close to Adrian Leclerc. Rowe swallowed. Close enough to argue, Poirot nodded. Close enough to kill. 9:05, the alibi that breaks Poirot turned sharply. Constable, he said, bring Captain Morton. Morton arrived days later, arms crossed, irritation barely disguised. You wanted me again, Morton said. Poirot's tone remained calm. At 9:05, Captain, where were you? Morton frowned. Aboard my ship, Poirot nodded. Alone? Morton hesitated. Yes. Poirot smiled faintly. Then tell me, Poirot said softly, why your deck lantern was extinguished between 9 and 9:10. Morton stiffened. Rowe blinked. It was? Poirot nodded. Yes, temporarily, Morton snapped. Lanterns fail. Poirot shook his head gently. Not that one, he said. It was relit carefully. Someone wanted darkness briefly. Morton's jaw clenched. Poirot leaned in. You left your ship, Poirot said quietly. You walked the dock. You heard the music end early. Morton's voice was rough. So did everyone, Poirot nodded. But you knew what it meant. Silence. Poirot continued. You went to Adrian Leclerc not to listen, but to stop him. Morton's eyes flashed. You can't prove that. Poirot smiled faintly. No, he said, but I can prove you lied. The motive emerges, Poirot turned to Rowe. Captain Morton's freighter, Poirot said, has used this dock irregularly for months. Rowe nodded. We noticed discrepancies. Poirot looked back at Morton. And Adrian Leclerc, Poirot continued. Noticed them first. Morton laughed bitterly. He was a musician. Poirot's eyes hardened. He was an accountant once, Poirot said, before he was a violinist. Morton froze. Poirot's voice was gentle but relentless. He tracked shipments by sound, Poirot said, by timing, by routine. Rowe inhaled sharply. The music told him when things moved, Poirot continued, and when they did not. Morton looked away. Poirot finished softly. And on the final night, he intended to finish it. Said of the night ends, Poirot stepped back. Captain Morton, he said calmly, you confronted Adrian Leclerc. You argued, and in the quiet that followed the music, you struck him. Morton's voice dropped. He fell. Poirot nodded. Yes, and you let the sea take the blame. Morton said nothing. Poirot turned away. One alibi, he murmured, has fallen with the tide. That night, Poirot wrote only one line in his notebook. Music reveals time, silence reveals truth. He closed the book. Now, Poirot said softly to Rowe, we listen to who speaks next. Chapter 6, The Silence That Did the Killing. The sea was calm the morning after Captain Morton's alibi cracked. Too calm. It lay like a sheet of polished steel beside Mariner's dock, reflecting the lantern posts with an honesty that made men uneasy. Hercule Poirot noticed this at once. When water became still, it forced people to look at their reflections, and reflections, he knew, told inconvenient truths. Captain Morton has not confessed, Constable Frederick Rowe said quietly, joining Poirot at the edge of the pier. Poirot nodded. Nor will he. Not yet, Rowe frowned. But you proved he lied. Yes, Poirot replied. And liars rarely rush to become honest when they believe the lie can still be adjusted. Rowe exhaled. Then what are we waiting for? Poirot's eyes remained on the water. For the silence to speak. Kept the danger of the wrong confession. By mid-morning, the dock buzzed with restrained urgency. Captain Morton's freighter had been inspected, irregularities noted, schedules questioned, and yet nothing that placed his hands directly upon Adrian Leclerc. That's enough for suspicion, Rowe muttered, but not for a charge. Poirot nodded. And so another danger appears. Rowe looked up. What danger? Poirot turned calmly. That someone else will confess. Rowe blinked. Why would they? Poirot smiled faintly. Because when the truth becomes heavy, people who feel adjacent to guilt attempt to carry it away. Rowe swallowed. You mean a false confession? Poirot finished gently. Yes. Almost on cue, Samuel Pike appeared at the far end of the dock, hands shaking, eyes red from lack of sleep. Rowe stiffened. Sir, he's coming. Poirot nodded. Of course he is. Pike's voice trembled as he spoke. I should have said something sooner, he blurted. I stayed longer than I admitted. I saw him after the music ended. Rowe leaned forward. You saw Adrian Leclerc? Pike nodded rapidly. Yes, and Captain Morton too. Poirot raised a hand. Slowly, he said. Tell us what you did, not what you fear. Pike swallowed. I heard voices, quiet, then silence. I thought it was none of my business. Poirot's tone was kind. And then? I went home, Pike said. I didn't touch him, I swear. Poirot nodded. I believe you. Rowe looked surprised. Poirot continued. But you are wrong about one thing. Pike stared. What? You believe the killing happened after the silence, Poirot said softly. It did not. In the body that told the truth, Poirot requested Dr. Leonard Frost to join them again. Frost arrived with reluctance and a folder of notes. You said there were no external injuries, Poirot said calmly. Yes, Frost replied. No bruising consistent with assault, no drowning, Poirot nodded. And the heart? Frost hesitated. There were signs of acute failure, sudden, Poirot leaned in. Stress-induced, Frost frowned. Possibly, Poirot's eyes sharpened. Possibly triggered. He gestured toward the dock edge. Doctor, Poirot continued, if a man were suddenly deprived of sound, and not gradually but instantly, could that shock be fatal? Frost blinked. Deprived of sound. Poirot nodded. The sudden vacuum after sustained stimulus, Frost considered. In rare cases, yes, especially if the subject were already under emotional strain. Poirot smiled faintly. Merci, Rowe frowned. You're saying the silence killed him? Poirot shook his head gently. No, he said. I am saying the silence completed what the sound began. The true method, Poirot, returned to the exact spot where Adrian Leclerc had stood. Imagine it, he said quietly. Hours of playing, sustained notes, repetition. The body adapts. Rowe nodded slowly. Now, Poirot continued, introduce confrontation, accusation, threat. Rowe's eyes widened. Stress. Poirot nodded. And then, abruptly, the music stops, Rowe whispered. Shock. Poirot turned. The killer did not strike Adrian Leclerc. With a hand, he paused. He struck him with timing, Rowe swallowed. So Captain Morton, Poirot raised a finger, is guilty of confrontation, not murder. Rowe stared. Then who? Poirot's gaze drifted toward the cafe. The listener who stayed, Helena March, had not slept. Poirot saw it immediately when he entered the cafe that afternoon. Her elegance had dulled, her hands trembled despite her composure. You are tired, Poirot said gently. Helena smiled thinly. Busy, Poirot nodded. The dock was your window, she stiffened. Poirot continued. You heard the violin better than anyone. Night after night, she said nothing. And you heard the silence, Poirot added, the moment it mattered. Her voice wavered. Everyone did. Poirot shook his head. No, he said softly. Only someone who stayed. Helena's eyes glistened. Poirot leaned in. You did not leave early, Poirot said. You stayed, you watched, and when Captain Morton confronted Adrian Leclerc, you spoke, Helena whispered. I only told him to stop. Poirot nodded. Your words were the final stress. She covered her mouth. I didn't touch him, she said. Poirot's voice was gentle. You did not need to. The confession that wasn't planned. Helena's confession came in fragments. She had known Adrian before Mariner's dock, known his past, known what he was counting. "He threatened to expose the cafe accounts," she whispered. "I begged him to wait." Poirot nodded. "And when he refused?" "I stayed," she said. "I wanted to hear how it ended." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "And when the music stopped," he said softly. "Your voice filled the silence." Helena broke down. "I told him he'd ruin everything," she cried. "He looked at me like he finally understood." Poirot's voice lowered. "And his heart could not carry the weight." Silence followed, not deadly this time, just honest. Poirot's judgment. Rowe exhaled slowly. "So Captain Morton didn't kill him?" Poirot nodded. "He provided the confrontation." "And Pike?" Rowe asked. "A witness," Poirot replied. "Not a killer." Rowe looked at Helena. "And she," Poirot finished, "delivered the final note." Helena looked up. "I never meant—" Poirot interrupted gently. "Intent," he said, "does not negotiate with consequence." She nodded, defeated. As Helena was led away, Poirot remained at the dock. The evening approached. Fog gathered again. Rowe stood beside him. "It was the silence," he said quietly. Poirot nodded. "Music," Poirot said, "can carry truth gently. Silence drops it." Rowe looked toward the water. "And Adrien Leclerc?" Poirot's eyes softened. "He finished it," Poirot said, "just not the way he intended." That night, Poirot wrote a final line in his notebook. "The loudest weapon is often the absence of sound." He closed the book. "Now," he murmured, "we listen to the sea." Chapter 7. The harbor that could no longer pretend. Mariner's dock reacted to the truth the way it always reacted to storms, not with panic, with adjustment. The morning after Helena March's confession, the harbor woke to routine sounds. Gulls crying, ropes creaking, engines coughing to life. Yet something essential had shifted. People moved differently. They looked longer. They spoke less. But when they did, their words carried weight. Hercule Poirot noticed this immediately. "The harbor," he murmured to Constable Frederick Rowe, "has stopped pretending not to know." Rowe nodded. "They're angry." Poirot smiled faintly. "Anger is merely honesty with raised volume." The law arrives quietly. Helena March was taken into custody without spectacle. No crowd gathered, no one shouted. She walked from her cafe with her coat folded neatly over her arm, eyes fixed ahead. The cafe window, once a perfect vantage point, reflected her back at herself as she passed. Poirot watched from the dock's edge. "She will not deny it again," Rowe said quietly. Poirot nodded. "No, she has already argued with herself long enough." Charges were explained carefully: criminal negligence resulting in death, coercive confrontation, obstruction through omission, not murder in the theatrical sense, but responsibility that could not be waved away by silence. "The sea," Poirot said softly, "does not accept partial confessions." The harbor responds. By afternoon, the cafe was closed. A handwritten sign appeared on the door, closed until further notice. People stopped to read it. Some shook their heads, others stood longer than necessary, as though listening for music that would never return. Captain Elias Morton remained aboard his freighter, his movements stiff, his authority diminished. No charges were brought against him, not yet, but his reputation had already been measured and found wanting. "He will be watched now," Rowe said. Poirot nodded, "as he should have been before." Samuel Pike returned to work, quieter than ever. He did not linger at 9. He did not wait for signals. He worked by the clock now, an ordinary clock, nailed above the warehouse door. Poirot approved. The violin without a player. Late that afternoon, Poirot asked Rowe to bring him the violin. It lay in evident storage, polished, intact, deceptively innocent. Poirot held it gently. "A fine instrument," he said. "It carried too much." Rowe frowned. "You mean the signal?" Poirot nodded. "And the expectation." He returned the violin to its case and closed it firmly. No more, he murmured. The violin would be returned to Adrian Leclerc's family. It would play again someday, but never here. Some places exhausted their right to certain sounds. Poirot's moral reckoning. As evening approached, Poirot stood alone at the end of the dock. Fog gathered again, faithful, obedient, unchanged. Yet it felt different now. It no longer concealed anything worth hiding. Rowe joined him. "You were right," the constable said. "It wasn't one villain." Poirot smiled faintly. "It rarely is." Rowe hesitated. "Then how do we explain it? To the court?" Poirot's eyes softened. "We do not explain," he said. "We present facts. The court will assign labels." Rowe nodded. "And morally?" Poirot took a long breath. "Morally," he said, "this harbor learned something expensive." Rowe waited. Poirot continued. "When people agree to let signals replace responsibility, they create permission for harm." Rowe glanced at the water. "So the music was the lie?" Poirot shook his head gently. "No," he said. "The lie was pretending the music was harmless." The last evening at Mariner's Dock that night, for the first time in months, the dock closed early. Lanterns were dimmed, boats settled quietly, the fog thickened, but no one mistook it for cover. Poirot remained until after 9, not to listen, to confirm the absence. At 9:05, the dock was empty. At 9:10, the water lapped softly. At 9:15, Poirot checked his watch and nodded once. "The night," he murmured, "has learned its boundaries." A letter written, not sent back at the inn. Poirot opened his notebook. He wrote a letter he did not intend to send. Adrian Leclerc used music to measure truth. Others used it to delay consequence. Both were listening. Only one understood what silence demands. Poirot closed the notebook. Some thoughts were meant only for the man who carried them. Should the harbor sleeps differently? Mariner's Dock slept that night. Not restlessly, not guiltily, but cautiously, Marty, as though aware that the smallest sound might now matter again. No violin rose at dusk, no signal announced safety, and for the first time, people trusted clocks more than habits. Poirot stood by his window and watched the fog drift. "It is not sound that tells the truth," he said softly. "It is what people do when sound is gone." Chapter 8. The tide that closed the case. The law arrived at Mariner's Dock the way tides did, without drama, without argument, and utterly indifferent to local sentiment. By the third morning after Helena March's confession, the harbor had been measured, catalogued, and quietly corrected. Statements were taken again, this time without evasions. Times were written in ink instead of habit. The dock's routines, once governed by music and mutual understanding, were reduced to schedules and signatures. Hercule Poirot observed the process with patient detachment. "This," he murmured to Constable Frederick Rowe, "is the least interesting part of every case, and the most necessary." Rowe nodded. "People expected more." Poirot smiled faintly. "They always do. Justice is disappointing to those raised on spectacle." The charges, plainly stated, Helena March's case was presented in careful language. No accusations of theatrical murder, no dramatic retelling of the dock at night, only facts. She remained at the dock after closing. She confronted Adrian Leclerc verbally during a period of heightened stress. Her actions contributed directly to a fatal collapse already primed by exhaustion and fear, criminal negligence, coercive pressure, failure to render aid. The law named what silence had tried to blur. Helena accepted the charges quietly. "I did not strike him," she said once, "but I was there when the sound ended." The magistrate nodded. That was enough. The others weighed and released. Captain Elias Morton was questioned again. Harder this time. His ship's irregularities were documented, his movements scrutinized, his influence reduced. No charges were brought, not for Adrian Leclerc's death, but the harbor authority revoked several privileges. Schedules would be audited, routes reviewed. Morton did not protest. He had already lost the only thing that mattered at the dock, presumed trust. Samuel Pike gave his statement one final time. This time he did not embellish. This time he did not apologize. He described what he heard, what he saw, what he did not do. Poirot approved. Truth, he said quietly, does not improve with rehearsal. Asm, but the dock without its music. By afternoon, Mariner's Dock felt strangely exposed. Without the violin's nightly presence, sounds arrived naked. Footsteps echoed, conversations carried farther than expected. Even the water seemed louder. People noticed. They began checking watches again. At 9 o'clock, heads turned instinctively and then relaxed. Nothing was supposed to happen anymore. That, Poirot said softly, is freedom. Rowe frowned. It feels empty. Poirot shook his head gently. No, it feels honest. Poirot's farewell to the harbour. Poirot packed his suitcase that evening, carefully, methodically. He placed his notebook inside, closed it, then opened it again. Not to add anything, but to confirm that nothing remained unsaid. The case was complete. Not because guilt had been assigned, but because responsibility had been accepted. He walked once more to the end of the dock. Fog drifted in thin strands now, no longer thick enough to hide intention. Lanterns glowed softly, unguarded, unimportant. Poirot stood where Adrian Leclerc had stood. He listened, not for music, for balance. Rowe joined him, hands in his pockets. "They'll remember this," the constable said. Poirot nodded. "They will remember the discomfort." Rowe hesitated. "And you, sir? Will you remember the violinist?" Poirot's eyes softened. "Yes," he said, "because he understood something most do not." Rowe waited. Poirot continued. "He knew that patterns tell the truth long before people do." A final observation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the tide began to shift. Water pulled away from the planks, exposing stones and seaweed, ordinary things that looked unfamiliar once revealed. Poirot smiled faintly. "Every harbour," he said, "has a moment when it sees what usually stays submerged." Rowe nodded. "And then?" Poirot turned toward the station path. "Then," he said, "it decides whether to remember." Departure without applause. Poirot left Mariner's Dock without announcement. No one gathered to see him off. No speeches were made. The harbour returned to work. That was how Poirot preferred it. From the train window, he caught one last glimpse of the dock, smaller now, stripped of symbolism, merely a place where water met wood. The violinist's room stood dark above the chandlery, empty, properly so. Poirot sat back and closed his eyes. The rails hummed beneath him, steady, impartial, precise. Tick, tick, tick. "Time," he murmured, "behaves better when we stop asking it to lie." The train moved on, and Mariner's Dock, at last, learned to do the same. Chapter 9. What the harbour remembered after midnight, the first midnight after the war. Case closed, passed unnoticed. No one gathered at Mariner's Dock. No one paused with expectation. No one waited for a sound to grant permission. That absence, Hercule Poirot would later decide, was the truest measure of change. The harbour had learned to exist without signals. In the days that followed Poirot's departure, Mariner's Dock settled into something resembling honesty. Not peace, honesty. The café remained closed, its windows dark, its once welcoming view of the pier now a blank reflection of sky and water. People walked past it without slowing. They did not speculate aloud. The story had finished explaining itself. Captain Morton's freighter still docked, but under stricter schedules. His authority had narrowed to its lawful shape. He spoke less now, listened more, an adjustment forced not by guilt alone, but by scrutiny. Samuel Pike worked steadily, his eyes often on the clock nailed above Warehouse 3. He no longer relied on sound to tell him when to leave. He relied on time. And that made all the difference. Adrian Leclerc's room was cleared quietly. No inventory list was posted, no neighbors gathered. The landlord packed the violinist's few belongings with care, as one might pack something borrowed too long. The violin case was sent ahead to an address in Belgium. A sister, perhaps, or a cousin. No one at the dock was entirely certain. Adrian Leclerc had not offered his life as context, only as pattern. Among his papers, one note was found folded carefully, never shown to the public. It read simply, "Sound tells you when to look away. Silence tells you when to look closer." Those who read it did not comment, they did not need to. At the harbor office, new regulations were posted: no informal signals, no private timing systems, no unregistered observers. The rules were ordinary, boring, necessary. People complied, not because they feared punishment, but because they now understood the cost of convenience. One evening, a week later, a young dockhand lifted a harmonica to his lips near the edge of the pier. He played 3 notes, then stopped. He glanced around, uncertain, as if waiting for approval. No one reacted. He lowered the harmonica and smiled faintly. Music, it seemed, had been returned to its rightful place. Expression, not instruction. Far away in a quiet London apartment, Poirot sat with his evening tea. He did not reread the case notes. He did not arrange photographs or timelines. The case had already found its proper shelf in his mind. Instead, he listened to the city, footsteps below, a carriage passing, a distant clock striking the hour, sound behaving normally. He smiled faintly. Poirot reflected on Adrien Leclerc, a man who hid himself to observe others, a man who understood that repetition exposed truth faster than confrontation, a man who believed he could finish a pattern before it finished him. "You were correct," Poirot murmured softly, "but you misjudged one thing." He paused. "You believed silence would protect you." Poirot closed his eyes. Silence, he knew, protected no one. In Mariner's Dock, the fog returned often. It always would. But it no longer carried authority. When fog rolled in now, lanterns were lit earlier, people spoke louder, movement slowed deliberately, not habitually. The harbor did not pretend fog was a curtain anymore. It treated it as weather. One night, Mrs. Agnes Bell, who had once paused to listen to the violin, stood at her window at dusk. She realized suddenly that she had not listened for music in days. She closed the window and smiled. The call. Harbor's children began playing near the pier again. They counted steps. They raced shadows. They laughed at echoes. They did not wait for signals. They waited for one another. That, too, was new. In a final letter received weeks later, Constable Frederick Rowe wrote to Poirot. It was brief. The dock still creaks the same way. But people don't use it as an excuse anymore. They ask questions now, even when it's uncomfortable. Poirot folded the letter carefully. "Yes," he murmured, "that is the habit worth keeping." Poirot's final reflection. Some mysteries ended with arrests. Some with confessions, some with clever revelations delivered to crowded rooms. This one ended with restraint, with fewer assumptions, with less convenience, with an understanding that patterns were not harmless simply because they were familiar. Poirot sipped his tea. "The most dangerous arrangement," he said, softly, "is the one everyone agrees not to question." He set the cup down. Time continued, honestly this time. Back at Mariner's Dock, another midnight passed. No violin rose, no hush followed. No one mistook routine for safety. The sea moved, the dock held, the harbor remembered. Not the sound, but the lesson. Chapter 10. When the music finally let go, midnight arrived at Mariner's Dock without hesitation. No foghorn announced it. No lantern flickered in response. No one lifted their head, waiting for a sound to explain what they were allowed to do next. That, more than any arrest or confession, was the ending Hercule Poirot trusted. The harbor had learned how to exist without instruction. On the final night before Poirot left the coast entirely, he returned once more to the dock. Not as a detective, not as an authority, but as a listener. The sea was restless but honest. Water moved against wood, with no pattern except nature's own. Ropes knocked softly against hulls. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's bell marked the hour, clear, mechanical, uninterested in secrecy. Poirot stood where Adrien Leclerc had stood. He imagined the posture again, the straight spine, the controlled breathing, the deliberate bow. A man who believed that repetition could expose truth faster than confrontation. "You were right," Poirot murmured softly. "But you chose the most dangerous teacher." Silence. In the days since the case closed, Mariner's Dock had begun the slow work of becoming ordinary again. Not innocent, ordinary. The cafe reopened under new ownership, its windows still facing the pier, but no longer claiming authority over it. The view was now scenery, not surveillance. Captain Morton's ship departed under stricter schedules. He did not look back when it left the harbor. Some men understood consequences only when distance enforced them. Samuel Pike was promoted quietly. Responsibility, it turned out, grew best in those who stopped trying to escape it. And the dock itself, old, scarred, reliable, continued doing what it had always done, holding weight, enduring weather, asking nothing in return. Poirot walked the length of the pier slowly. Each step echoed, not loudly, but clearly. The sound belonged to him alone, unshared, unmeasured. That mattered. At the edge, he stopped and looked out across the water. Somewhere beneath the surface, currents crossed without announcing themselves. No signals, no agreements, just motion. That, Poirot said softly, is how truth prefers to travel. The final understanding back in his room, Poirot packed with care. He folded his clothes precisely, aligned his belongings, then paused before closing the suitcase. He removed his notebook one final time. He did not add evidence. He did not summarize the case. Instead, he wrote a single sentence. Sound invites agreement. Silence demands responsibility. He closed the notebook and placed it away. Some lessons were complete when they stopped needing repetition. Classic radio-style closing, listener address. And so, dear listener, we leave Mariner's Dock. Not with music, not with accusation, not with the echo of a final note. We leave it the way truth prefers to be left, undisturbed. The violin is gone now. The fog still comes and goes. The dock still creaks under familiar weight. But something essential has changed. No one waits for sound to decide what is safe. No one mistakes habit for innocence. And no one believes that silence can be borrowed without cost. Adrien Leclerc played until the pattern revealed itself. Others listened until listening became dangerous. And when the music stopped, the truth had nowhere left to hide. Tonight, as you hear the ordinary sounds around you, a clock, a footstep, a breath, remember this. What guides us quietly can harm us deeply if we never ask why it exists. Good night, and may your silences be honest ones.